Welcome to the Eric Brady podcast, Series 1, Adolf Hitler, His Bombers and Me. Episode 31, Official Inquiries. Eric, do you know how Hitler's bomber was able to get through the air defences to bomb Sandhurst Road School that day?
There were a lot of barrage balloons. These were massive balloons that were tethered by a steel cable to the ground and sent up to a height. They looked quite pretty, being silvery coloured, but they had a deadly purpose as well. Deployed at the height that they were, bombers knew that they were tethered by steel wire, but they couldn't locate where they actually were. They were flying too fast and the steel cables did look narrow, and therefore to make sure that a wing wasn't torn off in colliding with them, they had to fly above the barrage balloons. On this particular day, for a reason that has never become clear, certainly not to my knowledge, the barrage balloons were all down in a straight line from the coast running right into central London, which was unique. That simply didn't happen, but it was on that day, and it was particularly on that line that the fighter bombers that came into this attack flew. They had been part of a big force that had attacked westwards from a central point along the ports, and another attack was going eastwards, and so splitting the fighter defences, because of course they had to go where the bombers were. And then, reaching a particular point, these two squadrons of special ground attack flyers came diving in, and they were able to go so low because of the barrage balloons being down. And that meant that any warning along their route just wasn't given in time, because the policy was that air raid warnings would only sound when an area was under immediate threat. That was to save life being disrupted over a very wide area, and of course wartime production also halting for that period. So they were able to come in along that lane straight up to southeast London, where the schools were located. As a result of that, there was a special inquiry set up by Churchill. There was a public report that was held in the Lewisham Town Hall that my mother and many others went to. It was reported, as I understand it from my mother, that they talked about what had happened, that the schools had been bombed, that various people had done sterling work in immediately going to the rescue. Neighbours to the school went with the first in. Others came in to help. The local vicar got a rope and organised gangs to haul aside the very big lumps of rubble. And he also made the church hall available for an immediate first aid location, because it was just across the road from Sandhurst Road School. The question also of compensation was raised at that meeting, but the families just turned that down. I mean, what could compensate them in cash terms for what had happened? But a collection was taken up by the Mayor of Lewisham, and that did collect a lot of money that was spent on the injured people. And in fact, after several years, the three worst injured had money given to them for whatever purposes, particularly educational. And I was one of the three. So I was given £100 in war bonds, and I got interested in that of about £1, 10 shillings every 6 months. There was a confidential inquiry set up by Churchill, and I discovered this much later when I was applying for the probation service. And obviously I had to complete a form, very detailed, of education and health. And finally, I was interviewed by a Home Office probation inspector. And May Irvin, I remember her name, was very interested in the bombing of the school and my injuries. And she asked me a lot of questions about that. I was a bit surprised about that because generally my health was reasonable, apart from the injuries, of course. And I didn't see health being a problem. But she told me that Churchill had set up a special inquiry, particularly because of the barrage balloons being down. And she had actually been one of the panel that had been on that inquiry. I said, oh, that's interesting. What were the decisions made? And she said most abruptly, I can't tell you anything about that. And that was the first time I met on the Home Office or governmental code of silence about everything. One was given to me about a reason for why the barrage balloons were close hauled on that day, was that a new radar system was being tested, and therefore all the barrage balloons needed to be down in a straight line, that there was nothing more sinister than that. And so I was accepted as a trainee probation officer, but then I had to find a place at university for their basic course, as it were, social work course. And I went to London School of Economics, LSE, and I was interviewed by a man, Professor Titmus, and another guy, Brian Abel Smith. And he was asking me a lot of questions about evacuation. And I couldn't make out why he was so interested in that. I'd had to mention the way my schooling had been interrupted. And that, of course, had been the result of evacuation. So as he was asking about that, obviously I answered. And he accepted me. And I discovered when I was at LSE that in 1942, just 3 years after the evacuation, he'd been commissioned by the government to do a special study of evacuation and its effect on the families, the children, and education. So he was interested in interviewing another evacuee all that many years later. He accepted me for university, so I then did the course. Was accepted as a probation officer in Staffordshire, and that was because I actually completed my training there. They had vacancy, so that was handy. And my wife and I'd married by that time and had one daughter, we decided that there were no vacancies in Kent, which was where we actually wanted me to go. And so we thought we'd stay in the Midlands to save up some money, and then in about 3 years move back to Kent. In fact, that never happened. The trouble was houses were costing so much more in Kent, but the major problem, of course, no vacancies came up in Kent in the area that we particularly wanted to live, which was near Kemsing, not far from Sevenoaks. I subsequently we had 2 sons, and we've stayed in the Midlands ever since. During my time in the probation service, of course, I've met very many criminals, and I decided after I'd been retired some time that I would write a book about that, with all the people that I'd mentioned, with their names being totally different from what they really were, and also heavily disguised. And that book is called My Life of Crime and Courts.
My Life of Crime and Courts can be ordered via ericbradybooks.co.uk.
I also drew upon various people I met in prison and as probation to write a crime series, but these were fairly light-hearted and based on a character I met who was full of ambition to be a crime boss, but he never made it because he was particularly incompetent at all the crimes that he did. And it's called the Alf King series.
As this podcast draws to a close, next time Eric discusses meeting Germans after the war. To order Adolf Hitler, His Bombers and Me, the Alf King series, and many other books that Eric has written over the years, go to ericbradybooks.co.uk. The Eric Brady podcast can be found on YouTube, podcast services, and at ericbrady.blogspot.com.